Our story begins not with a scream in the dark, but in the bright, sterile halls of a hospital, a place of healing and trust. It was here, in 2004, that a young woman named Maggie Ellis worked as a nurse. She was 27, with a warm, open smile that put her patients at ease, and a fierce dedication to her job that bordered on the spiritual. To her friends and family, Maggie was a ray of light, compassionate, resilient, and possessing an unwavering faith in the goodness of people. She had faced her share of hardships, including a recent divorce, but she was rebuilding her life in Roanoke, Virginia, focusing on her work and her beloved dog. She was the kind of person who would stop to help a stranger, the kind of woman whose trusting nature was both her greatest strength and, tragically, her most fatal flaw. Her world was one of order and care, a world where the uniform she wore was a shield, and the hospital a sanctuary. But a predator was about to shatter that sanctuary, using the very trust her profession represented as a weapon against her. The man who would orchestrate her nightmare was not a shadowy stranger, but a familiar face in the medical community. Dr. David Fuller was, by all accounts, a respected and accomplished anesthesiologist. In his late 40s, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who commanded operating rooms. He was married, a father, a pillar of a certain social standing. To his colleagues he was perhaps a little reserved, but competent, reliable. They saw the crisp white coat, the steady hands, the calm demeanor required for sedating patients for surgery. They did not see the meticulous twisted fantasy taking root in his mind, a fantasy that required a specific type of victim. A nurse, someone who would inherently trust a doctor, someone whose disappearance might be explained by the stresses of a demanding profession. He didn't hunt in alleyways, he hunted in the break room, his predation camouflaged by a stethoscope and a title. The trap was set with chilling simplicity. On a cool March evening, Maggie mentioned to a colleague that her car was having trouble. Dr. Fuller, overhearing this, offered a solution. He knew a mechanic, he said. He could give her a ride home after her shift. It was a gesture that seemed to embody the camaraderie of the hospital, a senior physician helping out a junior nurse. How could she refuse? To refuse would be to question the integrity of a man society had deemed unquestionable. And so, after her shift ended, Maggie Ellis walked out of the hospital's sliding doors and got into Dr. Fuller's dark SUV. It was the last voluntary act anyone would ever witness. The security cameras captured the vehicle pulling away, merging into the flow of evening traffic, becoming just another set of taillights in the night. Then, nothing. Maggie vanished. The investigation began with the slow, grinding mechanics of any missing persons case, initially tinged with the assumption that a young woman, recently divorced, might have simply needed a break. But that assumption evaporated quickly. Maggie was responsible. She adored her dog. She wouldn't just leave. Detectives retraced her last known steps, and the trail led them directly to Dr. David Fuller. He was polite, cooperative. Yes, he had given her a ride, he confirmed. He dropped her off near her apartment complex, he said. She had seemed fine. He expressed concern, the perfect picture of a worried colleague. But his story was a house of cards, and the detectives, now sensing the foul odor of a lie, began to blow. There were no witnesses to this alleged drop-off. Security cameras at her apartment showed no sign of her arrival. And then, the first major break, a forensics team, executing a search warrant on Fuller's SUV, found a single, minuscule fleck of blood in the cargo area, so small it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. The DNA was a match to Maggie Ellis. The case exploded. The respected Dr. Fuller was now the prime suspect in a probable homicide. The community recoiled in horror. How could this be? The investigation tore back the curtain on Fuller's life, revealing a man living a grotesque double life. While he maintained his facade as the family man and doctor, detectives uncovered a secret world of deviance. His personal computer was a catalog of horror, filled with thousands of images and videos of violent sexual bondage, much of it depicting women who were unconscious, restrained, and subjected to unimaginable acts. The themes were specific, repetitive, the medical setting, the power dynamic, the complete subjugation of a helpless victim. It became terrifyingly clear that Maggie Ellis hadn't been a crime of passion. She had been the star in a premeditated, psychopathic fantasy, a fantasy Fuller had been consuming and curating for years. He hadn't just killed a nurse, he had, in his mind, performed a procedure. But without a body, the case was agonizingly circumstantial. The blood spot proved she had been in his car, but not what he had done to her. The digital evidence proved he had the propensity for horrific violence, but not that he had acted on it. Fuller, sensing the weakness in the prosecution's case, clammed up. He invoked his right to an attorney, and the steady flow of information from his side dried up. He sat in his cell, a sphinx-like figure, knowing that the one piece of evidence that could convict him, Maggie's body, had not been found. The investigation stalled. For months, then a year, the case grew cold. Maggie's family was trapped in a purgatory of grief, and the prosecutors were trapped by the limits of the evidence. They had enough to charge him, but did they have enough to make a murder charge stick beyond a reasonable doubt? The fear was a looming, oppressive presence. A man capable of such a calculated evil might just walk free. Then, a gamble. A shocking plea deal was offered. In exchange for leading investigators to Maggie Ellis's remains, David Fuller would be allowed to plead guilty to first-degree murder and abduction, avoiding the possibility of the death penalty. It was a bitter pill for Maggie's family to swallow, but the need for closure, for the chance to lay their daughter to rest, was overwhelming. They agreed. And so, under the watchful eyes of law enforcement, Fuller, in cold, detached detail, directed them to a remote, heavily wooded area in the mountains of Bedford County. He had buried her in a shallow grave. The scene was one of profound desolation. The recovery of Maggie's remains provided the final grim confirmation of her fate, but it also, paradoxically, gave the legal system the leverage it needed to truly unmask the monster. The plea deal had a second, more critical component. Fuller had to submit to a full psychological debriefing. He had to tell them everything. What followed was not an interrogation, but a confession so cold and clinical it was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. Seated in a sterile interview room, David Fuller, the anesthesiologist, reverted to type. He spoke not as a remorseful killer, but as a lecturer detailing a complex medical case. He described in flat, emotionless tones how he had driven Maggie to a remote location. He described how he had injected her with a powerful anesthetic drug, a drug from his own hospital, rendering her unconscious. He described with horrifying precision how he then proceeded to enact the very fantasies they had found on his computer. He had sexually assaulted her while she was sedated, and then, when he was finished, he had injected her with a lethal dose of a different drug, suffocating her to death. He had used his medical knowledge not to heal, but to orchestrate the perfect, controlled violation and murder. He had turned his victim into a living prop for his fantasy, and then calmly disposed of the evidence. The only emotion he showed was a flicker of professional pride in the efficacy of his methods. The revelation was a seismic shock that reverberated through the courtroom when the details were later read aloud. This was not a crime of momentary insanity. It was a masterpiece of predatory engineering, executed by a man who saw a human being not as a person, but as an object for his consumption. The courtroom drama, when it finally arrived, was devoid of the shouting matches and dramatic reveals of fiction. It was a somber, gut-wrenching affair, its air thick with the weight of the known facts. Maggie's family sat in the front row, forced to listen as the clinical details of her final moments were laid bare for the record. Fuller, now stripped of his white coat and dressed in an orange jumpsuit, showed no emotion. He pleaded guilty, as per his agreement. The true battle was fought not over guilt or innocence, but over understanding. The prosecution painted a picture of a sophisticated, sadistic predator who had weaponized his position and knowledge. The defense, in a feeble attempt to garner some shred of sympathy, spoke of a man who was otherwise a productive member of society. A father, a husband, as if those roles could somehow counterbalance the profound evil of his actions. It was a hollow argument, swallowed by the overwhelming horror of his confession. At the sentencing, Maggie's mother faced the man who had destroyed her world. Her victim impact statement was a raw, powerful torrent of grief and fury. "You took my daughter's light," she said, her voice trembling yet resolute. "You took a healer and you made her your victim. You are not a doctor. You are a monster in a hollow shell." Fuller was given 2 life sentences plus an additional 50 years, a punishment that ensured he would die in prison. The judge condemned his unspeakable and monstrous actions, labeling him a profound danger to society. As he was led away, there was no sense of victory in the room, only a vast, echoing emptiness. A life had been extinguished, a family shattered, and a community's trust in one of its most revered institutions had been irrevocably broken. The most chilling truth of this story is not the violence itself, but the vessel it chose. Evil did not lurk in a dark alley. It wore a white coat, offered a helping hand, and spoke in the calm, reassuring tones of authority. It reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who hide in the shadows, but the ones we are trained to trust implicitly. He was a doctor, sworn to do no harm, and he used his sacred knowledge to craft the perfect murder. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.